Last year, a West Michigan real estate developer was championing the idea of dredging the Grand River to provide powerboat access from Grand Rapids all the way downstream to Lake Michigan. I became involved in this issue in my role as an extension educator for MSU Extension and Michigan Sea Grant. And the role of extension is really to provide science-based information to decision makers. And we've been involved in a variety of different projects that involve dredging in some way in the past, and we aren't necessarily on one side or the other of the issue. In fact, we've been involved in the Sustainable Small Harbors Coalition, and in this case, the sustainable aspect was really the lack of sustainable funding to keep small harbors dredged. A lot of small harbors around the Great Lakes really depend on federal, or in some cases, in some years, state funding to keep their harbors open. And this is an image from Leland in Fishtown. You can see that the Leland Harbor is right on Lake Michigan. You can pretty much throw a rock from any place in the harbor and hit the lake. But even here, they had such difficulty procuring the funding to combat the sand that constantly washes into the harbor mouth from Lake Michigan that they had to really resort to crowdfunding in order to purchase their own dredging equipment and keep that harbor open. But the project we're talking about today is very different than these small harbor dredging projects right on Lake Michigan. This project involves 22.5 miles of river from Grand Rapids downstream to the Bass River State Recreation Area. This is really a river channelization project, not a harbor dredging project. And the implications are very different because rivers work in very different ways than stagnant bodies of water. So what is river channelization? It is the straightening, widening, or deepening of stream channels, along with clearing or snagging to remove all of the woody debris and other stuff in the river that washes down and would potentially impede navigation. So at first this might seem like no problem. You make the water a little deeper, you allow for bigger boat traffic to come through, and you increase the economic benefits of tourism associated with that boat traffic. So if you deepen part of the river, there are unforeseen consequences. If you make the water deeper, you also increase the water velocity. And this has implications for the whole river, not just the area that you deepened. If you have water and sediment existing in a river channel where there's always some current flow, it reaches what's called a dynamic equilibrium between the flow of the water and the particles that are carried downstream either within the water column itself or on the bottom as bedload. So when you channelize a river, you disrupt this dynamic equilibrium, and the river over time will shift and redistribute particles. You'll see an increase in erosion in some areas and increase in deposition of sediments in other areas as the river kind of fights to regain its natural course. So stream ecologists speak about the four-dimensional nature of rivers. This means we have vertical dimensions, longitudinal, lateral, and temporal, which would be through time. And when you impact one aspect of the river, you impact all of these other dimensions as well. In this case, we're talking about increasing depth. And as I mentioned, that also increases velocity within that channel. But this also really affects the lateral dimension, because if you lower the bottom of the river, you're also going to lower the surface of the river. There's still the same amount of water coming through, right? So this potentially lowers the level of the surface of the river, making other parts of the river shallower. And this includes the floodplains, the backwater habitats where we have a lot of good wildlife and fish nursery habitat. You also affect the longitudinal dimension. This means we have downstream and upstream effects. Downstream effects are pretty easy to conceptualize. If you have more erosion and more stuff coming into the river, more nutrients, more pollution coming in from the erosion, then you'll impact downstream communities. In this case, we have Grand Haven at the mouth of the river. This image shows the Grand River plume already carries a lot of sediment, a lot of nutrients, a lot of stuff from the watershed. Upstream impacts are a little bit harder to visualize. So this video shows what happens in a stream simulation table when you dredge downstream off screen, and that dredge leads to head cutting. You can see how erosion eats its way upstream in the river channel. This lowers the level of the river even above where the dredge happened. And you can see that the banks are falling in due to erosion. You can even see that the dyed wetland area off to the left dried up because the water table was lowered so much by this incised river channel. Necessarily get an incised river channel with a dredging project, but when you do, you have a big problem because the incised river is deeper, narrower, higher velocity than it was before, and this leads to exposed sand and mud in off-channel areas, drying up of wetlands, a variety of impacts to fish. It can take decades or even longer for this river to start to heal and remeander and for fish populations to recover. Now, this is also a big problem for shoreline landowners, as you might imagine, with your riverfront property turned into a mud or sand flat. And if you have docks or boat launches, obviously this is going to have big impacts to them because where there used to be water to launch into, now there's exposed sand. Here's an image that really shows this. This is the Homachita River where dredging led to head cutting, and this area was upstream of the affected channelized area. You can see where a bridge washed out, and you can see where sand and mud flats were exposed on the banks of what used to be the river channel. In fact, the Homachita River was transformed from a river about 200 to 300 feet wide into a sand-filled floodplain over 3,000 feet wide. And the river became so incised that the river bottom dropped 15 feet in elevation from all the erosion that occurred. We've seen a lot of effects to different systems around the world, and one of them is that the peak sediment load increases. Sediment in the river leads to a muddier or dirtier look, right? Because the water is carrying more particles. In fact, the river carried 7 times as many particles in the River Main, Ireland after dredging. This turbidity is a measure of how muddy basically the water is, and turbidity increased 2.5 to 4.5 times in channelized stretches of the Missouri River. The Missouri River also lost side channel areas, and these are important because if you have an island in the main river, one side will typically be a little deeper than the other being the side channel, and if you artificially deepen one channel even more, that side channel area can become so shallow that it transforms into terrestrial habitat. So basically, your island becomes a peninsula, and you lose that important side channel, which typically is a good place for, again, fish nursery habitat and wildlife and things like that, because they can get some refuge from the degraded, channelized portion of the river in the side channels. Of course, that can't happen if you eliminate the side channel. Boat wakes are another issue. In one study in New Zealand where this was studied, they found that 18-foot boats generated 100 times more power than natural waves in the river. This also led to 20 times as much suspended sediment from those wakes hitting the sides of the river at a much higher velocity than natural waves would in a small river. Now, again, this is especially concerning for the Grand River because the proposal that was being talked about last year would have allowed for boats potentially up to 49 feet long to travel up and down the Grand River. And the study from New Zealand only dealt with 18-foot boats. So we can imagine much stronger waves, much more impact from the Grand River. So when you have all of these physical effects, you will also affect the biological community of the river. Benthic macroinvertebrates are small insects and other creatures that provide a lot of the food for fish in rivers, and they decline by 90% after channelization in the River Moy. In the Missouri River, benthic macroinvertebrates were at 8.5 times higher densities in unchannelized sections versus the channelized and degraded sections. Also, we lost a lot of really valuable sensitive species like salmon and trout in some rivers. In the River Boyne, the ratio of salmon and trout to other fish declined from 14.1 to 5.1. Other valuable but less sensitive fish can also be impacted. Largemouth bass are a warm water species that's pretty tolerant of a lot of conditions, but mean or average largemouth bass weight was 8 times higher in natural sections of the Luxapalila River versus channelized sections. And this is an incredible margin. We don't see impacts like this a lot in biology. Imagine an average of a 1-pound bass in one area versus an 8-pound bass in another. That's the difference between a pretty decent catch for an angler and a trophy. Overall biomass fish also can decline. Biomass of fish declined by 80% in channelized sections of the Chariton River, which is a smaller river, even a little bit smaller than the Grand. So we know we can have big impacts even when you have dredging projects on small rivers. So those were examples from individual rivers, but another study looked at 40 different streams in Indiana. Some of them were small, some of them were large, some of them were channelized, some weren't, and it found that there were 50% fewer sensitive fish species in the channelized areas of these rivers. Also, the Grand River itself has been studied, not very extensively, but there was a study in 1978 related to an earlier proposal to dredge the river, and it noted that dredging the river would definitely cause impacts to spawning fish and was one of the prime considerations that led to the river not being dredged at that time. Also, the DNR's own Wildlife Action Plan and Grand River Assessment clearly state that channelization is a major threat to large rivers and specifically the Grand River. So the bottom line is channelization is bad for rivers. Research is really needed to determine how bad and where the effects would be worst, but the basic conclusion looking at the literature from around the world is that channelization is generally not a good thing for the life of the river. The material on the previous slides was part of a literature review that was conducted for the Ottawa County Board of Commissioners. They asked me to create this literature review to give them a good idea of what to expect if the Grand River was indeed channelized. So, in addition to providing the review of published literature, as the year went on, we made an effort to get out in the field with biologists from GVSU and MSU Extension, along with the Grand Rapids Museum and others, to try to ground truth some of the claims that were being made about the river and the potential impacts. So before we get into that, I want to speak a little bit about the riffles and pools that are present in natural rivers. Riffle is a type of habitat that has large particles, boulders, cobbles, maybe gravel, and the water has trouble eroding these harder particles, so water tends to be shallower and faster as the river rushes over the riffles. This creates pool habitats below where the water scours out softer sediments. And from a fish's point of view, both of these habitats are important. The riffles are important because they have these hard particles that provide refuges for insects between the particles, and they also provide an excellent place for fish to incubate their eggs. The pools are important because large fish like to hang out in the security of the deeper pool water, and they also like to save energy by resting in the pool and waiting for food to drift down from the riffle above. So both of these are important to fish, and dredging, by definition, removes the riffle habitat and also degrades the pool habitat. Because dredging scoops out the shallow, hard-bottomed areas with large particles like gravel and cobble and boulders, and this also drops the level of the water in the pool. So essentially, you make the whole river homogeneous. You get rid of the shallowest areas, you get rid of the deepest areas, and this really leads to a degradation of the entire river habitat for fish, for insects, and also for mussels, which often need one or both of those habitats. So we found one riffle in particular in Kent County waters of the Grand River that would have been dredged under the Grand River Waterways proposal, where all of these fish were found. We found pike in the upper left there, muskie, which is the really large fish shocked by the DNR boat. It's known as the fish of 10,000 casts because it's a very rare apex predator. We found walleye and steelhead in the lower right, also shocked by the Michigan DNR crew. These are migratory fish that only come up to use the riffles when they spawn in spring. Both species can drop downstream and even use Lake Michigan during much of their life, or just hang out in the lower river for much of the year in the case of walleye. And in the upper right is a fish called the river red horse, which is a state threatened species only found in 3 of Michigan's largest river ecosystems. And this particular fish is special because it relies on another rare food source, which is freshwater mussels. Freshwater mussels, also called unionids, are not the same as the invasive zebra and quagga mussels you hear so much about. These are the most vulnerable taxa in the U.S. Roughly 70% of species are imperiled, and the reasons that they're so rare is because of impacts like dredging and damming and siltation of our rivers in the U.S. So freshwater mussels have kind of a unique life history too, because an adult mussel can't really swim upstream to disperse its eggs and young. They rely on fish, and here's the lure of a mussel. You can see that this fleshy lure looks like a couple of fish. You can even see fake eye spots, and the idea is the mussel lures a fish in, and when the fish attacks the mussel's lure, it squirts glochidia, parasitic larvae, into the fish's mouth, and those glochidia become parasitic on the fish for a short period of time. They hitch a ride upstream or downstream and disperse themselves into different habitats before they settle out on the sediment and grow older. So many rare mussels were found in the project area, including Michigan endangered species and threatened species. These were all found in Kent County waters, and it was claimed by the Grand River Waterways hired consultants that Ottawa County waters were really low quality mussel habitat. So that's one of the things that we set out to kind of ground truth, because they only surveyed a tiny portion of Ottawa County waters and just concluded that the rest of the river in Ottawa County is low-quality mussel habitat devoid of mussel life. The Grand River Waterways consultants also claimed that gravel bars are not found in Ottawa County waters, and that the woody debris and training walls that might be important habitat for insects and for fish were not going to be removed or damaged by the dredging project. So again, we set out to ground truth some of this with a variety of different biologists and folks from Ottawa County Parks, the Grand River, the Grand Rapids Museum, and retired MDEQ biologist Joe Rathbun, along with a few GVSU grad students and Professor Eric Snyder. So on September 7th, we went out and we did some mussel sampling. We looked at 3 sites in Ottawa County, and we found live species of special concern in Michigan at 2 of those sites. One of the sites had a diverse mussel community with 7 living species and dead shells of a state endangered 3-horned wartyback. So we definitely found that some of these areas that were not sampled by the consultants previously had pretty good mussel communities in Ottawa County waters that could have potentially been impacted by dredging. Also, we found that gravel bars do indeed exist in Ottawa County waters. It wasn't too hard to find. We just took a boat down the river on a day where the water was rather clear, and we got some photos like this one that show pretty clearly there's some areas of gravel and even cobble and boulder in Ottawa County waters that would have been part of that dredging project. In addition to some of these shallow areas off to the side of the river, there was one site right in the Thalweg, or deepest part of the river, that was shallow enough that it would have been impacted by dredging to the 7-foot level. So there was one entire gravel bar that would have been removed by the dredging project in Ottawa County. And finally, their last conclusion was that woody debris and training walls would not be affected by the dredging project, and we found, again, areas that you could see visually just taking a boat down the river, that woody debris was actually caught on remnants of the old training walls within the river channel in areas where the dredging would have occurred. So you can even see this from satellite imagery. This is a Google Earth image, and you can see the 2 training walls within the channel of the river here, and you can see some large woody debris hung up on those training walls in an area that would have been dredged under the project proposal. So the question is, are the economic benefits really enough to outweigh the environmental and economic costs? And there are some potential hidden costs here. For example, erosion
to public property, docks, and boat launches could add up to a pretty hefty price tag. One example from here in Ottawa County is Riverside Park restoration cost $184,000 just for 500 feet of shoreline that has been impacted by boat wakes at the end of a no-wake zone. Again, this is only 500 feet, and we're talking about increased boat traffic and a dredged channel along 22 and a half miles of the river. Also, there's the cost of ongoing dredging and tree removal, and this was estimated at $798,000 annually by Ottawa County. There's also an impact to existing businesses, and several existing businesses have spoken out against the dredging project. So my role with MSU Extension and Sea Grant was really just to provide information, but that's different than advocacy. So other groups like WEMEAC and the Friends of the Lower Grand River really took it a step further and used the information to try to encourage people actively to oppose the dredging project. And again, this is different than a strictly educational role. So the Friends of the Lower Grand River did produce a nice website that has a lot of news articles and other documentation about the project. And they also, again, took it a step further and tried to encourage people to sign on, along with WEMEAC, to letters of opposition to the project. And I'll note, too, GVSU Student Senate was the most recent addition to the list of groups that formally oppose the project. And that list grew to 49 last year as a number of other groups signed on to oppose the project or crafted their own resolutions in opposition. And this list includes Ottawa County, Board of Commissioners, many different municipalities and tribal governments, as well as business-oriented groups like the Grand Haven Chamber of Commerce, along with other NGOs. After it became clear that local governments, riparian landowners, and businesses were largely opposed to the project, the DNR formally scrapped plans for dredging in November of 2019, saying that it would disrupt fish habitat, natural vegetation, and the general health of the river. And although people on both sides of this debate really disagreed about how the river should be utilized, I think everyone could really agree with the fact that we have a great resource out there in the Grand River, and it would probably be a good thing to have more people taking advantage of that and getting out to enjoy the river.